Welcome, everyone, to the Early Neuropsychological Changes in ADRD webinar series. This webinar is digital phenotyping and markers. As a reminder, please take a look at the screen. We want you to mute yourself. Use the chat to register any burning questions, share resources, and during general discussion, each speaker is going to have 10 minutes of talk, followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. The speakers will get the first shot at questions. So please use chat. We'll try to pull as many as we can. But there will be a final webinar, number 6, in a few months, where any of the discussion points that come up here that may not get addressed, we can always bring to that general discussion towards the end. Finally, if you have any questions, you can contact myself or Ella Blue at Rose Lee and Associates. We'd like to welcome Rose Lee and Associates, who will be assisting us with the remainder of the webinars and are facilitating all the back-end things that are happening for this today. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Rhoda O from Boston University, who will kick us off. Rhoda.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to give you in 10 minutes the present and future about digital technologies. So number one, we all know that there's lots of digital technologies actually now being integrated into research, and particularly around AD-related research. I just wanted to give you a very quick history, though, about how short this history actually really is. So if you look at digital phenotyping and aging, you know, there's been about 140 presentations. Actually, if you look at the concept of digital biomarkers, which is often used interchangeably with digital phenotyping, there's actually even more studies going on. If we look specifically at Alzheimer's disease, the number drops a bit. But again, what's interesting is that the concept of digital biomarkers and is actually outpacing that of digital phenotyping. And that's very interesting because, in fact, much of what we're doing is digital phenotyping, and we have not gotten to the realm of digital biomarkers. So really what I want to do is talk about how do we get to a digital biomarker for real, even though we think we're doing it already. So one, we have to start with where we've been, which is, you know, to do our traditional data collection, but it tends to be high burden and it tends to be things that we do in person. Then, let's see here. We've now started to introduce these digital technologies, but they're active engagement technologies, and they lower the burden, but they're nonetheless burdensome. And where we really have to get to is where we get into passive engagement technologies, where we're monitoring on a daily basis. And so that's actually how I want to make sure that we have both what we're doing in the present and also where we need to go into the future. So the question is where to start. And I got to tell you, in order to do this, we're going to have to rethink how we do things, both in terms of our study design. We got to even think the concept of exclusion criteria when we're trying to be maximally inclusive. And that's going to impact then our study protocols. What are our analytic methods in which we're going to do this, and even the concept of what we now believe is gold standard. So I really want to make sure that we think about how we're not going to just do what we're already doing, but really pushing the boundaries forward. And I actually do want to go back and talk about blood, because blood really has been changing much of how we think about things. So, you know, the idea that we can collect blood, process blood, you know, there's lots of things in which we can do with blood today, and then we store blood. And what we've been doing in storing our blood is that it's really allowed us to keep pace with the advances in science. So today we have lots of different new things that we do with blood that we weren't able to do before, but because we stored the blood, we had it available as these scientific advances came upon us. And we continue to use blood in thinking about and storing blood for what might be in the future. So it turns out that we can take this same concept and bring it to digital. So with digital, we're at the stage where we're collecting lots of different digital metrics and we're actually deriving digital measures. But what I'd like you to think about is the concept of digital as the new blood. And I want to give you an example of how that has worked out using the example of the Framingham Heart Study. We started collecting digital voice recordings in 2005. And over these last 17 years, we've actually collected over 10,000 recordings across thousands of different participants, including longitudinally. Now, here's the important thing, though, is that our first publication related to the use of digital voice didn't happen to 2017. And in fact, I'd like you to notice that that wasn't actually a clinical journal. It was actually a computer science one. And it wasn't until literally the past few years that we've been able to take these digital voice recordings and convert them into science that speaks to the clinical realm. Similarly, in 2011, we introduced the use of a digital pen, starting with the clock drawing test. And again, over the years, we've been able to collect now and moving in now much more longitudinally across thousands of participants. And similar to what you saw with digital voice is when did this start to convert into science? Again, in 2016 is the first time we had our first publication. And again, it's not in a clinical journal. In 2017, we were finally able to get into a clinical journal, but I want to point out it took us 3 years to get it through peer review. And it's only been in the last couple years that we've produced most of the science. So this is what I want people to start thinking about, is that digital actually allows us to get to a level of equity that we're all striving to. There's low barriers to entry cost. You can obtain results very quickly and in real time. It can be very adaptive. And there are new emerging technological advances all the time. And one of the things that we've been trying to focus on more recently is the smartphone. And it's really with this concept of equity in mind, because it turns out it's the most penetrating technology in the world. And actually the growth of smartphone in the world is actually growing much more in low to middle income countries than in high income countries. So I think that this is basically a computer in every person's hand that we now need to leverage much more extensively as we're trying to move forward this digital reality. So I wanted to introduce you to some work that we're doing through the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative through the Global Cohort Development Program, where we took these principles of, digital technologies on mobile devices, both in a tablet and in a smartphone. We introduced a protocol that actually resembles a lot of what we've been doing at the Framingham Art Setting and also at BU Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So, but we're able to now take these technologies, push them into devices, and push them across the world. And so I wanted to give you a very brief summary of where things stand with our Davos initiative, which wasn't launched until January of 2021. So it's only literally 2 years old. And because we created a digital protocol that we thought could be feasibly deployed anywhere, we were able to get extraordinary traction, and particularly within low to middle income countries. So, so where we've been is we've been collecting data in the traditional way, but where do we need to go? And we really, again, are moving into digital technology, some of which will be actually discussed during the rest of this webinar. And they do bring lower burden into engagement. But again, as I mentioned, we really need to move this into passive engagement technologies. And again, parts of other presenters through this webinar are going to introduce you to some of those concepts. But I just want to emphasize this need to shift from passive engagement technologies, whether it's through, computers, online, and then again, through the home, and ultimately even through in-home sensors. And I really think it's until we get into this passive engagement reality, that's when we're going to start to see the potential of digital really take off. And so really, what are we going to do once we collect all this data? Well, we need to combine it with all the other data that we're collecting. We need to find different ways in which to share it and make it broadly accessible to the research community. And if we can do that on a global scale, then I think we'll be able to accelerate this reality of getting to a digital biomarker in the near future. So where can this all lead? Well, one of the things I think is very important is as we think about how do we accurately assess cognition, I think that, everything we do through our brain. So if we can start to monitor regular behaviors that we do in our natural environment, we're actually going to be able to infer cognition rather than test cognition. And that's going to get us to a much more accurate indicator of cognitive capabilities. I think that we're going to be able to take we are very good in research and coming up with lots of can'ts. And I think that if we put this data out there, we issue lots of challenges similar to what the X Prize has done, we can convert all those can'ts into can'ts. And that's really going to push us forward in terms of what we can do and how we can do it. I think the concept of data harmonization can be redefined if we can start to make sure that we push this forward. And then we, of course, have to also develop a lot of digital processing tools. So I always like to use space as an example of how we need to think about pushing our boundaries forward, because we used to think the world was flat. We determined it was round. We decided that we needed to explore beyond our boundaries of our own Earth. And as we've continued to move forward, I think with the most recent JW telescope, we've actually been able to start to see and understand things in a way that we've never been able to imagine before. And I really like to use this space exploration concept as a way to think about how we need to drive digital forward. And if we do that, I think we're going to enter into a new era of digital biomarkers that are multi-sensors combined with advanced analytics and really develop these dynamic fluid patterns that will drive sort of where we need to go, which are virtual clinical trials and clinical care. And so with that, I'd like to end by saying that we're in a wild west frontier. And I think that as we move together, we need to come together. And I think in that way, we're going to get to this digital biomarker reality. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we have 5 minutes. Marty Slawinski, Frank, and Dinesh from NIA will be our moderators. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Well, great. Well, great talk, Rhoda. I see one question in chat. And the question is, how do you answer the question regarding lack of standardized norms using digital markers from reviewers? So you've said you took one paper 3 years to get peer review. So how have you navigated this?
So I think, that's why I sort of put that we really have to have a shift in our mindset, right? Because if we keep trying to anchor how we're going to push this forward, and particularly through a peer-reviewed process, we actually have to realize that what we're trying to do is set new precedent. So in a peer review process, we always are worried about what's the previous precedent, right, in order to move forward. And I think that this is our challenge. I think that if we want to really see this move forward, we've got to rethink the concept of what does peer review really mean? What do standardized norms really mean? Because standardized norms were all based on old methodologies. And we're really pushing forward new ones. Now, realistically, that's what you have to do. The reason it took us 3 years is because we had to answer and link it back to what people know. And that's why I really want us to take this concept of space discovery, because no one ever gives you a map of here's how you get to the moon, here's how you get to Mars, here's how you get to see, billions of light years away. But you set the objective, and then you make your assessments based on it's getting to that goal rather than to the old goals. So I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Question from Laura Germain. She said she really likes the idea of digital being like blood, that analogy. And if you have any recommendations on best practices for digital data collection when the uses are not necessarily known in the future.
Yeah, so one of the things that I very strongly advocate is making sure that when you collect digital data, and I don't really care what it is, and I don't care from what device, you capture it in its raw native format. Because here's the thing, digital data streams use the same sensors, whether it's on a phone, whether it's on an in-home device, whether it's on a wearable. So if you get it in its raw native format, you allow the possibility then of maintaining best practices, not even for today, but in the future. So in that way, I think just like we collect blood in its raw native format, we need to collect digital in its raw native format and store that. And in that way, you'll be able to in that way, digital can become the new blood with the one differentiating factor that it's non-diminishing resource. So you can take many more chances with digital in a way that's harder to do with precious biospecimens.
How are we doing on time, Luke?
We have, actually now's probably a good time to close. And then if anybody has other questions, throw them in chat. We can return at the end. Thanks, Rhoda.
Thanks.
Jason, you're up next.
I'm Jason Hassenstab. I'm an associate professor of neurology and psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm involved in the Diane studies and obviously at our ADRC here at WashU. And I have a little digital biomarker laboratory that's been growing at a pretty amazing rate in the last few years.
Yep, looks good.
All right, amazing. So these are my disclosures, which my university requires me to put up. Nothing is really relevant for today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do to leverage high frequency assessments and specifically things you can do on a smartphone. So with smartphone based assessments, I think we can collect things over the course of like hours, days, and weeks, or even months without extreme participant burden. This may seem like a pretty obvious thing to say, but if you explore the possibilities with doing this, you can actually do a lot more. And specifically in ADRD, where we're really interested in learning and recall tasks, I think we can expand the way that we collect data by taking advantage of smartphones and not necessarily just by having people on the phone all day, every day, but doing it in little short snippets over the course of like extended periods. And that's what I mean by high frequency burst testing, is basically sampling people at different times of day, just randomly using principles from ecological momentary assessment. So in learning, there's obviously the short-term practice effects that we can look at with conventional paradigms. And there's statistical learning, which is just actually seeing things occur in time, which is like the way that we learn language, for example, as children. What can we do to expand these with smartphones? Well, there's a lot, and I can tell you a little bit about that in my next few slides. But then in recall, we assess recall in conventional formats, like even on a smartphone, you can do this. You give people information, you test their immediate recall, and you can do like what's a typical long delay period, which is actually only like 20 or 30 minutes usually in the clinic. But with a smartphone, we can extend that delay period, and we can extend the learning or the practice effect or the statistical learning period over like hours, days, and weeks, right? And then you can get to what I would, in the literature, is called long-term forgetting or accelerated long-term forgetting. And so those are two things that my lab's been working on recently to kind of take advantage of smartphone technology. So the first one is the statistical learning paradigm. And this is something that my very good friend and colleague Yin-Ying Lim at Monash in Australia began working on back in probably 2018 or so. And so it's a statistical learning paradigm where we actually teach people to read Chinese characters. And I'll show you what the paradigm looks like in just a second. But essentially, people see the character, they see a word, an English word, and they just have to answer the question, does it match or not? And the original task worked brilliantly, and we published a couple of papers on this now. But over time, people start to learn those associations despite being given no feedback. But the original task was 25 minutes a day for 6 days. So it took about 2.5 hours total. And of course, there were all sorts of issues with adherence and getting people to actually do this. They had to log on to a website, and complete 25 minutes each day for 6 days. That's a big ask of people and not really feasible. So what we wanted to do is take advantage of moving it, which was already online, to actually smartphones, and then shortening it down into little bursts. And so we worked with Marty, who's on the call, and Laura, who's on the call, to kind of sketch out this paradigm. And we got it down to 8 Chinese characters. The original was 50. We did them 6 sessions per day for 1 or 2 days, and each session was about 2 minutes. So the total assessment time was 24 minutes. So we took the 2.5 hours and shrunk it down to 24 minutes on a smartphone. And this is the way the task works. So for example, you might see in English word a character, and then they just have to answer the question, does it match, yes or no? And we don't give them any feedback at all. And then they might see the word noodle again, this time with a different character. And I believe this is the word for father or dad, but it's been a while. And then they have to answer, was it a correct match or not? The key thing about this task, though, is that they see the correct pairs much more often than they see the incorrect pairs. So just over time, they just start to make the connection that this is actually, oh, I see that with this one more often. And whether it's conscious or subconscious, that's another thing to debate, but people start to get it. And so here's what the data looks like, which I think is really cool. So we did the same set of 8 characters each day for 2 days. And then we wanted to see if there was a learning effect of just being familiar with the device itself, like a conceptual familiarity. So we did 8 characters on the first day, first a subset, and 8 new characters on day 2. And you can see with the learning curves here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. And day 1, they're basically just guessing because they don't know, we didn't give them the right answer. And by the end of the first day, after seeing the test 6 times, they get up to about 70% correct. And then on day 2, there's a teeny little drop off. And then by the end, they're up to well over 85% correct on this task. And you can see there's some people who didn't really learn and too much, but we're not really sure if they're paying attention. That's kind of one of the problems with this. And interestingly, when we gave them a different version on day 2, they totally reset it back to baseline. There didn't seem to be any sort of familiarity effect, and there was no statistical difference between the maximum amount they learned on day 1 and day 2. So that carryover effect is definitely there. They sort of picked up where they left the day before, and they continue on. And what I think is remarkable is that this mirrored almost exactly the learning curve that we saw in the original task, which was 2.5 hours. So this is the same data, just presented in a different way. You can see that they both start at essentially chance, and then they end up at about 83%. And then this goes 52, 73, 49, 75. So you can see when we switch to new characters, the learning curve basically totally reset itself. So I'm really excited about this, and we're actually working on developing this a little bit more and putting it into actual Alzheimer's participants, because these were just people who are community volunteers from a volunteer registry we have at WashU. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was long-term forgetting, which is something that I think we can do on smartphones a little bit easier than we can do like in the clinic, for example. And when I say long-term, I mean long-term. And these tasks we're focusing on recall after 7 full days. And I've actually seen papers where they do this for like 6 months, 30 days is a common version. And this is from a paper that we did back in 2018 now, in the before times, as you say, with the Diane population. So we had 21 mutation carriers and 14 non-carriers. So these people have a pathogenic mutation for Alzheimer's disease that usually causes it very early in the mid-40s. And we gave a traditional 20-30 minute delayed recall task. And interestingly, we found no group differences. So I can't remember if it was the AVLT or the CVLT, we gave them that test and logical memory, and there was no differences between groups at 30 minutes. But after 7 days in this task, we actually, this is Phil Weston's group at UCL, he called them on the phone and said, hey, remember that list, remember that story? And actually mailed them a paper package that had a visual recall. And interestingly, on the list learning test, there was much more of a decay in the mutation carriers than there was in the non-carriers, despite having normal and no difference performance between the 2 groups in the clinic. So I thought this was really encouraging. And we now take this in a prototype form on smartphones. And we came up with a word list test and also a card matching test, which is kind of like the card game memory, where you have to flip over the cards and find the pairs. And so higher scores are obviously better on a list learning test. You can see this beautiful learning curve across the 3 trials, and then this beautiful forgetting curve over 7 days. And the higher scores are worse because the number of attempts they have to match these, goes way down and then goes way back up. So I think we're onto something here that might reveal a little bit more sensitivity than the typical test. And I just wanted to emphasize that these are the kind of things that you can do with smartphones that you really can't do realistically in a clinic, like having people come back to the clinic every day to take a learning task, or have them come back after 7 days, is kind of a big ask and not really financially or logistically feasible for people. And I'm going to end there because I think my time's probably up. And I just want to acknowledge a few people, including Marty and Laura. You're not on the slide, but you should be. And of course, our participants and families. And that's all I wanted to say. And just one last plug, I am looking for a postdoc. So if anybody wants to come out and design computer tasks and robots with us, let me know. But I'm happy to take a few questions.
Great talk. I have a question actually. So in your slides, when you showed sort of the progression of the mobile orca results and over day 1, day 2, and you mentioned that there was like some individuals who seemed to have different kinds of behaviors in terms of how they were learning. Is there a plan to kind of like identify how these individuals like adopt different learning strategies or different approaches to the app and kind of break them down into subpopulations?
Yeah, we haven't really done anything like that, but that's an interesting idea. I think one of the things that we were looking for is the people who are just kind of like tapping it to get their money, like as we pay people for this. So there's obviously that element whenever you do remote studies, that there's those people that are just like non-compliant and don't do it. But whether or not they can't actually learn the task is another thing. We actually made a different version of this and did it in a Down syndrome population, which is a grant that I hopefully will get funded pretty soon that we're working on. And they could do it, so they could learn the task too. So I don't think there's anything going on. It's not too difficult, for some people, but there are some people that just get totally flustered by the lack of feedback on this task. And so that's the kind of thing that we're working on now, is kind of like gently trying to hint at them some sort of a strategy without sort of giving away the store, as we say in the United States.
There's a question from Dana. I was it just came in a moment ago. She asks, has anyone tried to also capture face and eye tracking? Maybe an iPad would be a better choice for that in conjunction with this sort of testing.
Yeah, there's a lot of work from people doing that right now. I consult on a couple of projects that are using eye tracking. People use it as a measure of validity, to make sure that people are actually paying attention. People use it as a measure of mind wandering, which is a whole other area of cognitive psychology. And I'm sure there are other people that are can speak more eloquently about this than I can, but you can use the front-facing camera on most smartphones, not all, but the technology is so good. The problems that we've had in the project that I'm working on now is finding good enough light source to actually get the tracking. And then they usually have to do like a little bit of a calibration task at the beginning of the task. And sometimes you have to do it on each day. So you have to like teach the participants, like face a window, like, obviously you can see the sun blaring on my face right now, face the window. So there's enough light on your eyes so they can actually track your pupil. And in people that have really dark colored eyes, it has a little bit harder time finding the thing. So there's a little bit of a setup, but most phones are perfectly capable of doing this. And the data look reasonably well, pretty high correlated with the in-lab software that most people use.
That's perfect. We actually have more questions, but I think we're going to put that to the end so we can move on with the next talk. Thanks so much for the great talk.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so up next, Dina Katabi, you can share your slides and briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Very nice to be here to talk to you. And we heard particularly from Rhoda about the importance of like having things to be passive, having things that do not add burden or require excessive engagement from patients. And what I want to talk to you about is this move from wearables to the invisibles. Like, can we actually remove the need for any engagement, collect digital data and digital biomarkers in a completely passive way? And this is exactly what my team, both at MIT and also at Emerald Innovations, a company that we co-founded, have been working on. So imagine if we can have a device that looks very much like Wi-Fi box at home, sitting in the background and analyzing the radio signal that are bouncing around, and from that, getting the patient's movement, sleep, behavior, activities, interaction with caregiver, vital signs, all of that stuff, without asking people to enter information actively, or to wear devices on their body, or to do anything, just live their lives. This is exactly what we have. We have developed this sensor that's called Emerald. It analyzes a radio signal that bounces around, and from that, it can get sleep, breathing, vital signs, mobility, interaction with caregivers, activities, all of that stuff. And of course, internally to do this, it is analyzing these radio signals with novel machine learning algorithms. I want to show you a few examples of what we can do with just radio signal that is bouncing around all of us. So here what you see, this is one person on my team. You see this big arrow here. So our wireless device is not even in the same office as this person. We're gonna monitor him from the adjacent office or through the wall, because radio signal traverse walls. What you see on the side here, you see this red dot. This red dot is where the device thinks that this person is standing right now. Now let me play it for you. And as the person moves, you see that the red dots tracks him. And remember that we are able to track his movements from behind the wall without asking him to wear sensors on his body, or no actigraphy, nothing, just based on how his body changes the radio signals around him. Now, as you can see, we can track him accurately. And indeed, for everything that we do, we compare to the gold standard. In the case of motion, is something called the Viking Motion Capture Room. And this is what you see in rehabilitation hospitals. But I want you to think with me, what happens if you can track actually how people are moving inside their homes? Apart from the fact that now you can get a measure of their gait and activities, you can actually track it to behavioral symptoms. So you can see how much time they spend on the TV couch, for example, whether they live a sedentary life, whether they how often they enter the kitchen for their eating behavior. You can, like, for example, look at withdrawal behavior. For example, somebody who is like in their bedroom, they don't interact with anyone, they hardly get out, and particularly if this is a change from an earlier behavior. You can look at sundowning behavior, like somebody like reaching to the window, or agitation, pacing back and forth, repetitive behavior. So all of this is completely passively. But what else can we get from the radio signals around us? So when we go to sleep, our brain waves change and enter different stages: awake, light sleep, deep sleep, and REM, or rapid eye movements. Now, these sleep stages are related to sleep disorders. But of course, in all neurological diseases, there is a sleep factor. And in fact, I mean, if we think about diseases like Alzheimer's, not only we know that sleep gets disturbed, but also we know that the slow waves during deep sleep are really important. So today, if you want to get an assessment of sleep that gets to the depths of these sleep stages, you send someone to a sleep lab, they put these electrodes on their head and body, and they ask them to sleep like this. Now, of course, you can't do this every day. In fact, it is amazing that we expect that this person is going to have their typical sleep with all of these sensors on their head and body. But what can we do if we are dealing with someone who has dementia or Alzheimer's and we want to track their sleep on a daily basis? Let me show you our device. This is our device. Transmits very low power wireless signal, analyzes the reflection of the signal using AI, and spits out the sleep stages throughout the night. Now, this graph that you are seeing here is actually something called a hypnogram. For each 30 seconds of sleep, it tells you which sleep stage the person is in, like REM, light sleep, deep sleep. Imagine for every 30 seconds. And of course, as I told you, for everything that we do, we compare to the gold standard. And in the case of sleep, is this something called PSG, which is these electrodes that you saw on the person in my previous slides. So here also a person who's sitting like you, all of you guys, and what you see on the screen is his inhales, exhales. So we are able to get his breathing signal with the radio signal that bounces off his body. We asked him to hold his breath, and you see the signal stays at a steady level because he exhaled, he did not inhale. And again, this is at very high accuracy in comparison to FDA approved breathing bell that the person has to wear on their body. In fact, if we zoom in on these respiration signal, we see the inhales and the exhales, but in fact, you see small blips on the signal, and these are heartbeats. So effectively, not only we can get the respiration, but the radio signal that bounces off people's body is very, very sensitive. It can get the pulsing of your blood. Over the past 2 years, we have been working with pharmaceutical company, health stakeholders in the healthcare domain, and a variety of diseases. And I'm going to talk a bit about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So I'm just going to show you 2 examples, one from Alzheimer, one from Parkinson. Our study in Alzheimer has focused on agitation, and our earlier study there we did with Dr. Ipsit Vahia from Harvard. So I'm just going to show you a very small example here. So we know that in Alzheimer, the vast majority of patients have behavioral symptoms, and agitation is quite common. Now, it's very hard to quantify agitation today because actually it's hard to quantify any behavioral symptoms. So let me show you this patient. So this green box here is our device. This patient, this red circle here is the patient. I'm going to play this video, and you're going to see the patient going back and forth between like entering the door, getting to her bed, and getting off the bed. This is a patient who's in her 80s. So I'm going to play it. I'm just going to speed it up so that you can guys see it. Getting in, getting out, getting in, getting out. Again, she will keep getting in and getting out. So this repetitive behavior, which is a sign of behavioral symptoms of agitation. And what we were able to do is to track this. And here what you see on the x-axis is the individual days. And for each day, you see the number of this repetition back and forth. And you can see this is somebody in their 80, and on a single day, they can do like 300 of these back and forth, back and forth. This is, of course, a very big signs of agitation, and the doctor was able to change the medication to control her agitation by looking at this repetitive behavior. I want to end with talking about biomarkers, and particularly biomarkers in neurological diseases, where our interest is really to be able to detect these diseases very early on. So if you think about disease like Alzheimer, Parkinson, we typically detect the disease almost a decade after the onset of the disease in the brain. And that actually is very limiting in our ability of treating the disease and developing drugs for the disease. So one of the questions that we asked, and this is a study that we did in Parkinson, and we would love to do something similar in Alzheimer. But the question that we asked is, can we detect Parkinson's disease from symptoms that are different from the motor symptoms? So typically in Parkinson, we wait for the motor symptoms. And as a result, we end up like sometimes waiting to see motor symptoms, delaying the disease detection for 5 to 10 years. So here is a very simple question. Can AI detect Parkinson's from nocturnal breathing? So we know, as I said, that there are sleep behavioral and sleep changes in Parkinson, also similarly in Alzheimer. So why don't we just ask machine learning model to try to detect Parkinson from nocturnal breathing? So we took breathing signals that look like this from both Parkinson and non-Parkinson patients. We trained a neural network, and the neural network was trained to answer 2 questions. Does this person have Parkinson's? And if he or she does, then what is the severity of their Parkinson according to the gold standard, which is in this case, the MDS UPDRS? And we did a very large study with almost over 7,000 patients, 7,000 participants, 700 PD patients. And this is in collaboration with MGH, Mayo Clinic, and University of Rochester. And let me show you the results. So here you can see the results. This is something called the ROC curve that shows sensitivity and specificity. If you haven't seen these curves before, all that you need to know is the AUC. So the AUC is a measure, you can think of it of accuracy, and we can detect Parkinson from nocturnal breathing with an accuracy that is almost 90%. Okay, so this is really exciting to us because, as we said, now if we detect Parkinson from breathing, maybe we can detect Parkinson early before like preclinical. So of course, there is not much data where you have seen people before and you have collected their breathing signal with wireless before they got the disease. But we went to a sleep study and we have data from people who went to a sleep study twice. That are separated by 6 years. And we looked at them in the first sleep study and said, okay, can we take their breathing and detect who is going to have Parkinson's? And then 6 years later, we'll discover whether those people have Parkinson's or not. And here is the answer. So the blue are the people who developed eventually Parkinson's. And you see this yellow line, and you can see that the device already, the machine learning already detected that those people with very high probability have Parkinson's. 75% of them, remember, this is 6 years earlier than them declaring that they have Parkinson's. And all the people that did not have Parkinson's, the red ones here, the machine learning is very, very certain that they don't have Parkinson's. So I want to end with this saying that the technology and the ability to use this combination of digital health, of these like invisible things that we can put in the environment to collect huge amounts of data, opens up a new possibility that were not available before, and new way of thinking about how to detect diseases, how to track them, how to improve life for patients and for their caregivers. I will stop here, take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Throw questions in the chat.
Yes, so let me see, where do they start? Maybe Luke.
I think some of these questions were for the preceding talks. People are probably writing in their questions as we speak. In the meantime, I have a question, unless Marty, you want to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Frank.
So first of all, that was an awesome talk. I was wondering a few things. So with regards to the agitation example where the patient was coming in and out of the bed, like that was like a positive example of like the positive class, but in that study, was there also kind of, I guess you must have looked at the behavior of like typical people matched for age and so on, and was there a significant difference there as well?
So yeah, so we always like compare with a control in all of our studies, and in fact there are very different differences. So in the case of the agitation, actually what we see is in Alzheimer the routine gets broken. So when you look at the behavior, you see that when you compare them with the control have way more ritual behavior, while the Alzheimer's have less ritual. In the case of the Parkinson, also we see that the control have like faster movements. The device is able to predict them as like non Parkinson's. In the case of the sleep, actually, the device maps things back, differences between control and patients that we can align them with a technique in machine learning called attention to a period in time where there is a difference in the EEG signal in different bands between Parkinson's and control. So there are always differences from control that, interestingly, we can see that they are statistically significant. So we can in all of these neurological diseases, one of the things that you care about is this statistically significant. And in fact, we can show that they are statistically significant.
Great. There's a bunch of questions now. I think we'll only have time for a few of them. One of them was about like how much earlier you think, I mean, you talked about machine learning predicting PD up to 6 years or something before it was diagnosed, but did you think there's like some kind of limit? Like how much earlier do you think we can make these kinds of predictions?
So we don't really know, and that's really it's an opportunity that we are just scratching the surface. And I have to emphasize again, the study that we did a very large study with 7,000 participants for detection. But the one that is early on, it was a smaller size. It had about 500 individuals, 12 of them developed Parkinson's in the future. So we need to do more studies to actually understand exactly how far in the future and reconfirm these study that actually it is like statistically significant with prior to in the preclinical case. But basically we are very excited that for the first time we see these kind of like results. And so I can't give you exact time. I can tell you that we saw pretty early, like up to 6 years, but this needs much larger study. And also what kind of like, so there are different like subtypes even underlying Parkinson's.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question. Is that okay, Luke? So Ganesh asks if you can comment on how Emerald can distinguish between multiple individuals at the home. Like obviously there's a bunch of people going in. How do you tell them apart?
Yeah. So of course, so we can actually so think about it as very similar to a laser, like actually in driverless cars, like how like you can use laser technology to separate different peoples on the street. So you can do something similar with wireless signal. So it can distinguish between different voxels in space and separate people that based on their spatial separation.
You also have to maybe label like this is the actual participant.
And we
this
use
is
machine learning classifier to label participant, and everyone else goes to a different class.
Sounds perfect. Thanks.
Somebody is asking, is this sensor on your wall, Dina? And actually, yeah, so this is the sensor. This is the Emerald sensor. I use it for my own sleep.
And we can open it up. Certainly we can take more questions for Dina, but we can also open it up for general discussion, which Marty, Frank, and Dinesh, you guys will be running. So keep throwing questions in chat, but we'll open it up to Rhoda, questions for Rhoda and Jason too, I know, including earlier ones.
Before we go to the general discussion, I just had a question for Dina in terms of how this can be scaled up. Because right now it's limited to a specific environment where you can actually embed these sensors, right? And it's really cool, you know, that you can actually get all this information non-invasively. So, but to get better information, you know, are there any thoughts in terms of this can be scaled up to get real world data once a person leaves the particular environment where these sensors are currently?
Yeah, so I think it's really about so I keep telling people, so if you think about Wi-Fi, like can we scale Wi-Fi more than it has scale? No, I mean scale to almost every environment. So it is the same thing, like you can, like once we actually we develop more of this technology, I mean, it can be as available as Wi-Fi in every single environment that people go to and monitor all of that stuff. It's just that as you start, it's always the case that it takes some ramping up.
Okay, I guess we'll move to the general discussion now. Thank you very much, Dina. You know, I had a comment in a question that you know, especially regarding Rhoda's presentation. So this may be directed to you, but for anyone, the promise of sort of passive engagement technologies is really interesting, and I think it's very interesting to consider new types of biases that might introduce that we don't have to face, for example, with active measurement or structured measurement. For example, we know people are very smart and adaptive and may select into and out of activities as part of this sort of selective or loss-based adaptive processes that are part of human development. So we may end up missing some data that of deficits that are exposed only when people are in certain circumstances. So that's just one thought. But a question I had is, what aspects of cognitive function do you think can be captured passively, and what don't you think can be captured passively?
I actually think all aspects of cognitive function can be captured passively, quite frankly, because again, it goes back to this concept that everything we do through our brain. So everything is interpretable based on our cognitive capabilities and changes. You know, even changing from doing an activity to not doing an activity is indicative, right? As you shift from being able to do something that's routine to it becoming less routine. And it's not going to be one signal. I think that that's really important for people to understand, is that it's going to be a combination of multi-sensor signals that combine. And I always like to say that that's what we do behaviorally. When we understand someone to have a cognitive impairment, we don't actually in the real world focus on one thing that that person does. We actually look at a multitude of different things that they're doing in all sorts of different environments, and we pull that together to represent that. So I think this idea that we keep looking for one device, one application, one of anything isn't going to get us there. We literally are reflecting our cognition all the time. We just have to figure out now, how do we capture it and analyze it so we get, and we'll be a lot more accurate actually than we are now.
That's a very interesting response, because again, we're still just talking about cognition generally. It'll be really interesting to see how this gets played out in practice. So how we could, for example, passively extract deficits in object location binding, which we know might have a very close connection to specific types of brain dysfunction. So I think generally I see this, but it'll be really interesting to see how we can kind of get the specificity we sometimes look for. Dina, I'm sorry, were you going to?
Martin, I think it's very interesting also what you said about the change of behavior, and this actually we see all the time when and it was one of the major reasons what motivated me. Like when I started like my research at MIT, I was using devices that we asked people, or like asked them to provide us information and stuff like this. And we went to something like we call in physics like basically the Heisenberg principles, or just to change the activity, or you change the process by measuring it. And so for example, like when we do some study like where we are trying to use camera for ground truth with people related to sleep, and then we see people turn on the camera. We see them with the wireless signal. They turn on the camera because they want to, like they are part of clinical study. They have to do that. You have this sleep. They go to it, and then they wake up, turn off the camera, go back to bed, and continue sleeping. Yeah, and the similar thing, we noted this with EEG bands on people's head, which was completely also passive in the sense that they were just even noticing, they would just take the band and throw it, some of them, because they just cannot sleep. So I think that the more you ask people to do something or to change their behavior, the more you might be interfering with the thing that you are trying to measure.
So I have a follow-up to this conversation here regarding passive sensing. And this is an idea that's generated a lot of interest at NIA. So this, it's several folks have, demonstrated interest in promoting this. It's been approached in a distributed approach so far, and we're trying to collate these efforts now. So it's a great opportunity to get real rich data, right, that can be used to generate new information. So from an NI perspective, I was curious in terms of what the speakers have to say in terms of what are the barriers, that are there that for passive and specifically continuous data measurement, because when you talk about passive, you're continuously getting a lot of data, right? It's large swaths of data coming in over the course of a day and over long periods of time. So, what are the kind of parallel? Apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened.
No problem.
So what I'm looking for is recommendations or thoughts from the panel in terms of what we at NIA should be considering or addressing in parallel to just promoting passive measurement. Right? I mean, what are the issues that we can face when we're doing this, so we can actually incorporate those in the initiatives we are developing?
Yeah, I have some points, but maybe Rhoda, you can, and Jason, if you want to go first, and I can then add my points.
I mean, I would tell you the biggest barrier right now is peer review and this idea of precedent. I mean, the concept that you have to have precedent to do this is really difficult. And it makes, and it's not like Dina, for instance, isn't making great progress, but she could make so much better progress if people would take the same kinds of risks that we do with space exploration. That's why I keep doing that. We put the investment into mapping out new directions that we haven't done before. And because the NIA system is so precedent-based, it's actually a huge difficulty, even with active engagement technologies, never mind passive engagement, where you have to discover what these different passive measurements, how you're going to analyze them in different ways to come up with clinically meaningful. There is one company that has started to do this at a large scale, and that's CryptoWire. They're not in the AD space at all. They're actually in the mobile security space. They've had a lot of funding from DARPA, by the way, and this is where this concept of ARPA that you have may be the direction that you need to think about. But they have been able to collect continuous, quote unquote, continuous, because they've figured out how to do continuous without continuous. They do it with less than 2% of the battery, and they've been able to take all the digital sensor data and convert that between 88 to 100% accuracy on different behavioral measures. And they've done it on, at least last time I saw, was over 1 million people, and they were on their way to 2 million.
Yeah. So let me second that. So one of the like was why the Parkinson study was possible, why we were able to show this in Parkinson and not in Alzheimer, despite the fact that actually, if you think about it, I mean, the connection between sleep and Alzheimer is much more documented than in Parkinson's. It's the reason is because we had some funding, internal funding inside MIT to start a study to show some initial results, because without any initial results that show actually improve the concept before you apply to the NIH, it would not be possible. So now to do something similar in Alzheimer, we need to have a study before the study, which kind of like the chicken and egg problem. The second thing that I want to say is that NIH come from a certain mentality. Traditionally, it is a biomedical community. And there are certain things that sound easy to the biomedical community and certain things that sound hard. When you are bringing machine learning and computer science and technology, it's not the same set of things. So I hear in the NIH, and it's repeatedly, oh, like the data and how do we scale to many devices? And I asked, like, how many devices, guys? Like, just like, oh, like 1,000, 100, just like all of these things are easy if there are the resources for computer scientists. Data, for example, how do we manage a cloud? Like we are managing, like as we are speaking, there were devices in multiple homes, like hundreds of homes that we are managing to almost 1,000 homes, just sending data to the cloud and like managing continuously that data, like the device that you saw in my home. So this is easy for a computer scientist. It's just that you need to bring the right set of people to the problem, like the biopharma people to the clinical part of the problem, the computer scientists to the machine learning and the digital side of the problem, so that you don't have to be dealing with hardships that are not necessarily a hardship. It's just a hardship because you didn't put the right resources on them.
So thank you, Dina. So we're at time. I appreciate everybody taking their time to share with us and present, and some excellent stuff that we didn't get to that we'll also document. Dana Schlosser at OBSSR at NIH shared some resources for funding opportunities for research folks here that you might take advantage of, some that are new. Thanks again, as always, to the leadership team. And our next webinar, I believe, is next month, February 10th, where we'll be getting into neuropsychiatric symptoms and other things of that sort outside of cognition for early detection. We'll be in touch. So thank you again. Feel free to email me or Ella. Thanks again to Ella for running things on the back end, and have an excellent, excellent day.
And thanks, Luke, and everyone who made this possible behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.